Hello and welcome to NDTV. I'm Aditya Kaul. Over the last few days, there's been a crisis unfolding in Venezuela with the US Delta Force troops, in fact, leading an invasion in the country and then capturing President Maduro. Maduro, in fact, will be produced in a court and thereafter facing the justice and the wrath of the US system. But what does this say about the changing global order and how United States is trying to work out its own hegemonic tactics? Joining us right now is Ambassador Sinha, the former ambassador to Venezuela. He's been the High Commissioner to UK and Sri Lanka as well. And of course, he's India's former Chief Information Commissioner. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us and taking out time. Let me begin by asking you your first reaction to what you saw. You've been there back in 2007 to 2010, but that was a different time, certainly. Although socialism was being pushed at that time as well from a former leader. But what are your impressions of what you saw on the television screens and social media of the kind of invasion that happened and the way the president was captured?
Well, it reminds me of a bygone era of gunboat diplomacy. If you recall, Noriega of Panama was also captured and then brought to the US for justice, again accused of narco trafficking, drug trafficking. In this particular case, I think it was expected that the US, after mounting such a large armada on the Caribbean Sea just outside Venezuela, that some action is imminent. And what sort of action, of course, everyone was guessing. But frankly, I didn't expect that in the first few days of the new year, an assault would be launched in this manner.
Right.
The way he was captured, the stealth with which the Americans moved in, and the fact that they pretty much managed to neutralize the defenses and capture President Maduro and his wife, and then take them to a ship, the Iwo Jima, and then of course to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and then from there, of course, to New York to stand trial. And the visuals of him in handcuffs, and, blindfolded initially, and then later on walking around, sends a very powerful signal, I would say, to the rest of the world and certainly the countries in the region.
Well, also, you must have heard Donald Trump when he spoke a day after the capture of President Maduro. And a lot of what he said was less about drug trafficking, a lot about the oil diplomacy and how there is oil infrastructure, at least 19% of it in Venezuela, and how the US companies will now create inroads and try to make Venezuela great again. What were your impressions on that? Is this United States trying to work out a new kind of a colonial system? And also, what kind of a message does it send when we are talking about a multipolar world, but the United States hegemonic tactics clearly out and open?
Well, what struck me when he said that now we've moved from the Monroe Doctrine to the Donroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
But this power grab or the land grab or resources grab, whatever you call it, is nothing new, especially regarding with respect to Venezuela. Because, before President Chavez came to power, I think in 1999, Venezuela was ruled by governments which were pro the US, capitalist governments, and the oil production was pretty much in the hands of American and European countries, mainly American. So what happened was that initially in 1976, I think, the National Oil Company of Venezuela, PDVSA, was nationalized, and then in 2007, President Chavez took control. So as a result, a large number of the Americans and European companies, apart except Chevron, I think, left. So what happened was that the investments that they had made in technology, in machinery over time got degraded. And the sanctions that followed against Venezuela impacted their oil production and their oil exports. So a country which has the largest reserves of oil was reduced to exporting a minuscule amount compared to what their output was earlier and what the potential is. So I think what has happened is when President Trump says it is our oil and that they're going to run Venezuela, he's harking back to a period where American companies had pretty much the run of the land in Venezuela. And that is why there was a reaction by Venezuelan people, by the voters, and they sort of voted in Chavez, a charismatic socialist leader who was in the army. But of course, President Maduro, his successor, is not the same sort of, how do I put it, in the same class, or it doesn't have the same charisma that
Right.
Chavez.
Also, what does this say about the political system in Venezuela right now? The vice president has been directed by the Supreme Court to be the interim leader as the president, but the kind of statements that have been coming in, the defense minister of Venezuela saying that we are not going to surrender, we want the president to be returned back, and then the kind of a show of strength that he has shown, the kind of press conference he did with his senior leadership behind him. Then we have other senior leaders from Venezuela also speaking out and saying that we are not going to surrender and we are going to fight till the very end. Do you think these are just messaging tactics and finally they will have to succumb and perhaps form a government that toes the line of the United States?
I think militarily Venezuela cannot stand up to the US. It's quite clear this operation, Absolute Resolve, or whatever it was called, clearly proved that. However, putting troops on the ground is a completely different thing. So unless you have people there who are prepared to do your bidding and run the government there. In fact, President Trump implied initially that, the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary was standing behind him at that press conference would be running Venezuela. Of course, the Secretary of State has backtracked since then. Now there is talk of Delcy Rodriguez, the Vice President, who's a very experienced leader. She'd been Foreign Minister, Finance Minister, Oil Minister, of course, Vice President. Maybe she, maybe because the Secretary Rubio claimed to have spoken to her already. So matters are still very nebulous, very unclear. So we don't know what is going to happen. Right now, yes, Delcy Rodriguez is the interim president. As per the Constitution, elections should be held in 30 days. But if the West, and particularly the US, follow the line that they've been taking, that the last election was flawed or fraud, and Maduro had stolen the election, then the winning candidate, if you call him so, Edmundo Gonzalez, should be the president. And as last I heard, he was in exile in Spain. So I think it's a very murky situation. I don't know what's going to happen. The key is the Venezuelan military. If the Venezuelan military remains solidly behind the ruling party, Delcy Rodriguez, their defense minister, the heavyweight Padrino, even their interior minister, who's actually the number 2 in the party, Diosdado Cabello, who has held various important positions in the past, including governor of Miranda, again will be a key person. He's been indicted along with the Maduro family in the New York court.
Right.
So we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. Because if the army and the loyal, solid supporters of Maduro and the ruling party remain united, then it's going to be a very difficult task to get them to do their bidding. Of course, the US has extraordinary leverage, military and otherwise, over Venezuela. So we'll have to wait and see how they exercise that.
Well, certainly this is not going to be easy and we'll be tracking that very closely here on NDTV. But Ambassador Sinha, as a seasoned diplomat, what kind of repercussions or consequences do you see diplomatically and geopolitically on this entire situation, especially when the Russia-Ukraine war is underway? What kind of a message does what US did here convey to Russia and China? Does it empower Russia's stand and China even more? Because here is Europe trying to challenge and support Ukraine and challenge Russia and say that you are completely trying to violate the sovereignty of Ukraine over the last 4 years. And here is United States that did not even care 5 minutes to violate the sovereignty of Venezuela.
I think the simple message here is might is right. So I think a hegemon, superpower gets emboldened. In my opinion, this opens a Pandora's box. And you mentioned Russia and China, but there are other countries too. So I think, obviously, the whole multilateral order has been turned on its head. And I think 2026 promises to be a very interesting year. And we are still, 5 days into the new year.
Well, certainly, tariffs was the way forward for Trump to really shake the diplomatic corridors and countries all across in 2025. This time around, it seems to be oil and Venezuela. But there is a fresh threat that Donald Trump has issued against Cuba and Colombia as well. Do you think there are other countries in the vicinity that need to be worried?
Certainly, I think the charge officially is drug trafficking, narco terrorism, etc. Now that has to be proved in court. As far as I'm aware, Venezuela is hardly a conduit for either fentanyl or cocaine. But the indictment reads as if it is, especially on cocaine. So we will have to wait and see the sort of evidence being produced in the court against Maduro and the other people indicted. But we all are aware, and there were reports, US reports, that indicate that Venezuela is not really a channel for narco sort of trafficking into the US. It's countries like Mexico and Colombia and others. So I think we'll have to wait and see. Cuba certainly has been named because there's traditionally hostile relations between Cuba and the United States. And if they prevent Venezuelan oil from reaching Cuba, that would have a grave impact on Cuba's economy and stability. So I think the countries in the region obviously must be quite worried as to what's going to happen next. Frankly, the whole world needs to be worried because this is, after all, a violation of international law.
This is violation of international law, certainly, and of course, when it comes to United States, it doesn't seem like that they believe entirely in international order. But I want to ask you one question also about the kind of diplomacy that US engages in, especially right now during the Trump administration. You spoke about the international law, but what about the international rules-based order? Because when it comes to India, when it comes to Global South, when it comes to many other countries, maybe even China, the US is out there to preach about international rules-based order, even preaching India about democracy in the annual religious freedom reports, etc. But doesn't this really question the duplicity of the United States? Because when it comes to them, there are no rules. When it comes to others, they better abide or face consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, this respect for human rights and democracy is actually quite a charade. If you see the track record of the United States, not just in the Americas, but even outside. I mean, recently you had Iraq and Afghanistan. You of course had Noriega being picked up from Panama. Earlier on, you had Allende being removed and a military dictator installed in Chile. And of course, nearer home, you have a failed marshal who is the best bud. So, he's very close in with this administration, at least at the White House. And you have a situation on our eastern flank where, there was an uprising, supposedly, a mass movement to depose an legitimately elected government. And in place, we have a system which is not even constitutional. And then we have the Jamaat and the jihadis, having a free run. In Syria, we have a person who had a bounty on his head, who was part of Al-Qaeda, maybe reformed, who's now the president. So the US plays these games. It's very difficult, to fathom what they're up to. But certainly the double standards and the hypocrisy is for everyone to see.
That's right. But as a seasoned diplomat, again, I want your comments on the kind of, regime change operations that we have witnessed over the decades, where US's involvement has been absolutely clear and they haven't shied away from it. But the kind of tariff wars that we have seen over the last 1 year, and India and US have been engaged in trade talks. There have been 25% plus 25% tariffs imposed on India. There have been very angry reactions by Donald Trump. In fact, more than 60 times he came out in public saying that he was the one who made the ceasefire between India and Pakistan after Operation Sindoor possible, but he's not getting the credit for it. Do you think that there will be an amicable solution? India certainly is not going to recommend him for the Nobel Peace Prize, which he knows very well. But what is the amicable solution? And maybe I should point directly, does India need to worry in future about a regime change operation?
You see, India is not Venezuela. and India is neither is India Syria. So India is a completely different case. I mean, regime change, I won't comment because there is talk about how, the various left-leaning, liberal, sort of multinational organizations have been responsible for regime change or attempts at regime change in our
Right.
neighborhood. But, the fact is that we need to be very careful, very mindful. And you mentioned, religious freedom, etc. I mean, these are all sham reports. These indexes, they're based on, it's an echo chamber.
Right.
And the echo chamber obviously exists in India. Based on their feedback, they grade India along with countries. I was shocked to see some of the ratings where India was ranked below countries like, well, I don't want to name countries, but certain countries who have a far, far worse record. So it's all politically motivated. But India is, I'm going to be very careful with my words. They're mindful, we are aware, and whatever we do will be in our best national interest. And I think that is why the Prime Minister's emphasis on Atmanirbharta is so very important. It's not just a slogan. It is something, obviously, we cannot achieve overnight, but we really need to, in mission mode and in all of government mode, try and achieve you cannot have complete Atmanirbharta, but certainly in critical areas, whether it's defense, whether it's critical minerals, etc., we need to achieve a great deal of self-sufficiency. And of course, don't forget that India is also a nuclear power. So, I mean, there are limitations on what countries can or cannot do. But I think we need to study this situation carefully. While Venezuela is far away from us, we live in a very troubled neighborhood. And you see what is happening in our neighborhood. I've been posted in some of those countries in the neighborhood, so I know what is happening. And I think we have to be very mindful. And,
Ambassador, if I can interject, because my last question was going to be that. Because Dr. S. Jaishankar, while speaking in Chennai just a couple of days ago, he spoke about India having bad neighbors. While he was talking specifically about Pakistan and Operation Sindoor and what happened to the Indus Water Treaty and of course the Pahalgam and the Red Fort attacks. But there is the question of the UNIS government in Bangladesh, the rise of the Jamaat and the BNP. There is of course the left government in Sri Lanka, which is again abiding by the One China policy, One China principle. There is of course a new interim government in Nepal, where of course elections will be held, but currently there is a crisis that is unfolding. So how should India be worried? Because on 4 different corridors, and there is Taliban, where we have strategic ties with Afghanistan now, but you never know. There is rise of some radical groups like the ISIS, which apparently Pakistan and some others seem to be supporting. So how worried should be India when it comes to India's neighborhood?
I think the way you described it, obviously it sounds very worrisome. But if, for instance, Sri Lanka, where I have served as High Commissioner, I think the government in the EM, Dr. Jaishankar was there recently, there is constant communication between the governments. We've invested heavily. And more importantly, we are the friend in need, the first responder. And the Sri Lankan government and the people know that.
Right.
And I'm sure they're grateful for what we've done. As far as Nepal is concerned, of course, it's an evolving situation depending on elections. Now, Bangladesh is obviously a matter of concern and should be a matter of concern for us because the forces that are ruling Bangladesh, I mean, the chief advisor, in my opinion, is just a front. It was paradropped by the West, if I can put it that way. Paradropped as chief advisor. The real force behind these advisors, student advisors, etc., is the Jamaat. And the Jamaat, if you recall, had opposed the creation of Bangladesh. They were collaborators with the Pakistanis. And I'm surprised if the Bangladeshis, of course, a generation has passed, but they, I'm sure, remember the loot, the rape, the brutality that the Pakistan army in Bangladesh pre-December 1971. And then who basically hit them? I mean, we all admit that it was a joint force, Indian Army and Mukti Bahini, the Indian Armed Forces that liberated Bangladesh. But we know exactly who had the preponderance, who had the forces, without which Bangladesh would never, not never, but would not have been created then,
Right.
for sure. And so I think we have to weigh the situation carefully. The elections, which I believe are in February, are going to be important. We have reached out to the BNP, to Mr. Tariq Rahman, the son of the late BNP leader Begum Khalida, and I think we are treading cautiously, but we have many cards to play as far as Bangladesh is concerned. But I'm sure the government will weigh all the options before deciding how to proceed. I do hope that after the elections there is a government in power that sees the wisdom of good relations with India and how good it will be for Bangladesh and the Bangladesh economy. So I think it will be in mutual interest if both the countries are able to work out a modus vivendi and work together.
Ambassador Sinha, as always, a pleasure to have you here on NDTV. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you.